Rich Siaba and Kevin Lynn were deep into Florida's caving scene when they visited a frequented swimming hole directly above a winding cave. Madison Blue Springs has only one major challenge, and they plan to avoid that section, so it should have been a relaxing adventure. But the pair ran into problem after problem, cascading into a nightmare underwater. Did they overcome the sudden dangers of the deep, or did the cave claim their lives? Rich and Kevin were no strangers to the inherent challenges of cave diving. They had to contend with deep waters that could cause sudden cognition problems, and they had to worry about extra environmental hazards like sharp rocks and constricted passages that could make regular diving problems 100 times worse. Thankfully, the two had been through a lot of trials already. They were both cave-certified divers, which means they first underwent hours of physical training and learning to obtain a regular scuba license. Then, they had to get an advanced certification by practicing navigation techniques and by diving up to 60 feet deep, all before trying overhead environments in easy caves, totaling potentially hundreds of hours worth of experience. Needless to say, they were well prepared for this tame cave. It was supposed to be a walk in the park. They drove to a campground on the west bank of the Wittalahuchee River, parking at a lot and paying a fee at a staffed building to gain entry. Staff was used to cave divers visiting the area, so having people nearby gave a bit of a safety net for cavers. If something went wrong, staff could react fast and maybe even save lives. A short nature walk took them to a spring pool glistening in the Florida sun that extends to the wider river along steep banks with tall trees and plants all around. A couple wooden docks are set up to help swimmers and divers enter and exit the water. Everything pointed to a plush and relaxing vacation-style cave, free from most dangers. Still, Kevin and Rich weren't taking any chances. They brought with them 3 reels of line each, one more per person than the standard 2 reels for safety. That way, if a guiding line broke, they could potentially fix it and find their way back by tying to the remaining part of the line. They also brought a full set of cave-ready gear, including classic backplates, classic wings, lights that were mounted on belt and on shoulder straps, and wrist-mounted nitrox computers capable of relaying depth, diving time, and gas absorption information. Loaded up with their black, heavy gear, they sat on the edge of the steps and slowly walked into the water. Swimmers sent them some confused glances and asked questions. They were used to the curiosity, and they politely replied until it was time to go below the water surface and down to the mouth of the Madison Blue Spring. The water was clear and warm, which were more good signs that their trip would go smoothly. They swam down through a crack in the rocky floor, past ledges of rock that looked like they could have been from an above-ground cave. The ceiling narrowed under the first ledge, but there was plenty of room along the width of the tunnel. The rocky tunnels beyond were sharp and filled with boulders. The current could be strong, either pulling cavers along or pushing against them, depending on the location. But on that Sunday in 1999, everything seemed fine. Further into the cave, the limestone floors have been worn away. And in 2020, cave divers have found aquatic ocean fossils preserved in the rock next to a guideline. Who knows what the pair might have found back then as they swam side by side, following the sharp ledges formed by lower water flow from a long time ago when the shape of the land was much different. They were at peace in the silence of the dark tunnels as they swam through the cave's main tunnel, which connected to a large room called the Horseshoe Room that had large stone structures dividing it in the middle. There was also a side shaft that could be accessed right away, or they could carry on to the main tunnel, which was also divided by rocks in the middle. The pair likely ignored the side chambers and traveled along the main route, enjoying the calm waters. Later on, a few side passages could take divers through a side passage known as the Godzilla and Monkey Rooms. Going forward and around a bend led to a connection to more side passages and another passage known as Matt's Sink. Further along the main route, the tunnels got constricted until they reached a tight bend known as the Half Hitch. Just past that, there was one small side passage. They took a glance down its winding rocks, but they carried on. The cave then split into branch-like passages. The most famous section at that point was called Rocky Horror. which was an extremely narrow section with numerous small turns and a couple of very tight bends. Larger cavers can easily get stuck in the Rocky Horror section, forcing them to place tanks in front of them to pass through. There's also a sign at the entrance to warn cavers about the tight tunnel. Using a clip on the sign, cavers can indicate when they've entered the passage, and then switch the sign back to indicate they've made it out. That section was too tight for groups to pass by one another, and cavers leaving the tunnel always had priority. Getting stuck here could be deadly. Rich and Kevin weren't ready for a claustrophobic nightmare, so they took the left fork instead. Visibility was clear up to 100 feet as they entered the passage called the Roto-Rooter, which had a depth of 78 feet. This was the furthest and deepest point the pair reached before turning around. They may have been able to push it, but with their safety-first mentality, they wanted to get back topside with more than enough left in the tank. Although the floors look pristine in some areas, much of the floor of Madison Blue Spring is covered in a layer of silt, fine mud, sand, and plant matter that can be frustrating to deal with. Even though visibility was great, the tight passages of these sections and a few spots along the main tunnel could easily cause divers to kick up sand and silt, making it almost impossible for the person behind them to see the route ahead. The second person could get stuck, and with all the sand and silt, the person in front wouldn't be able to see them to know if they were okay. With no signals to communicate, cavers can easily become stranded. They return to go through the half hitch, which is known as a restriction, at an area too narrow for two cavers to fit through side by side. But this time, the flow of the water was stronger at the restriction, which made visibility worse. Clouds of dark particles swirled in front of them. They were now in what's known as a silt out. The sand and grime had become so mixed with the water that it became a hazard. As they attempted to squeeze through the half-hitch restriction, the person in front lost guideline. This happens when caving, so that's why they brought extra reels of line. They deployed their safety lines and tied themselves to the known end of the guideline, and hopefully they could extend outward in different directions until they found the other end and the path to safety. But the more they searched, the harder it became. Every movement made the silt out worse. As they felt around the ground for the line, more sand rose into the passage. Adding to their struggles, they had to keep passing through the restriction, which was already difficult, and the low visibility made it even harder. Their gear got stuck, and they had to unhook it temporarily to fix it. Then they got turned around trying to follow the wall. They couldn't even see their watches. Everything was going wrong. Even just one of these incidents could be deadly, and they were now dealing with 3 problems at the same time. Yet, using their expert caving knowledge, even with zero visibility and no guiding line, they somehow pushed forward through the restriction. They were still close together, and they were on the right path. Then, they found the downstream line. They were saved. As they progressed, they let the line through their fingers, leaving the frayed end to float behind them. But then, another disaster struck. Eventually, the frayed end of the guideline wormed its way around them, tying them up and limiting their movement. They didn't notice until they were already in another bind. They had been underwater for nearly 2 hours and were close to their air limit. Panic was setting in. With all their training, Rich and Kevin knew how to handle each problem they faced, but not all of them at once, or one right after the other. It became overwhelming. They started cutting through their lines, until one of them signaled to the other that something was wrong. The next morning, staff at the Madison Blue drove to work and found Rich and Kevin's cars parked in the same spot from the day before. Sickened, they immediately called emergency services, followed by direct calls to rescue divers. 3 skilled cave divers came to the rescue, including one of the most influential cave divers of all time. The first rescuer was Lamar Hires, president and CEO of the Dive Right Company. After just 5 years of cave diving, he had completed over 1,000 dives, helped map many of the caves in Florida, and, learning from experiences like this rescue dive at Madison Blue Springs, he invented innovative scuba technology, including a mounting wing for heavy canisters that's now called the Classic Wing. He also partnered with Seiko Epson to create the first programmable nitrox computer. Since then, he's served on the International Cave Rescue and Recovery Team, and as of 2020, he's still innovating with a new optimized rebreather that can better absorb CO2 to prevent buildup in the diver's lungs, and it recycles oxygen to extend the life of their air supply. The second rescuer, Mike Bruce, was part of the family that owned the commercial campground where the springs are located, and the third went by the name Tony, presumably Tony Flaris of the National Speleological Society cave diving section. The rescue divers split into groups, with one tackling the side passages in the Godzilla room while the others swam along the main route. By the time they got there, it was likely too late. They were still holding out hope that the pair brought extra gear and went down for a second dive, or maybe they had illegally camped above ground after finishing their dive. As Tony and Mike swam through the half-hitch restriction, located around 850 feet into Madison Blue Spring, they found the main guideline. It was still broken, which was a bad sign. If the men had found it, they would likely tie their own safety line to the other end to complete the chain until future cavers could replace the damaged line. The silt had settled on the cave floor, and as they looked up from the guideline, Tony and Mike found Kevin and Rich. One of the divers had removed his gear, floating there in his wetsuit with his tanks and harness off. The other had everything on. They were both tangled in the permanent line placed to guide cavers throughout the whole route. They were floating upright near the ceiling. Kevin and Rich were facing one another with their arms outstretched as if they had gone for one final hug, one last reminder of friendship, family, and those who they would soon leave behind. One last moment of warmth before the cold darkness of the cave stole their last heartbeats. They were already gone. They each died desperately trying to get one more breath out of their spent tanks, until reactions took over and they breathed one final lungful of water as the clear limestone and blue waters faded into darkness. Focused on gathering evidence, the team checked their gear. The disposed gear was completely out of air, but functional. The other caver still had 500 psi. Normal ranges can go over 4,000 pounds per square inch, so even though it was low, one of the men still had some air left. Could have been the panic that got him, confronting his fate as he saw his friend perish before his eyes in the swirling gray murk of the cave. After getting their bodies untangled from the main line, Mike grabbed the main line and swam with it to reconnect it. The cut pieces made the line shorter, so Mike had to connect some of his own reel to it. Once more past the restriction, he found the line which had several other lines tied to it. Possible that the line was already broken and Kevin and Rich just didn't notice it. Or they had got turned around in the silt out and tried connecting the wrong end. Once they reached the surface, the rescue divers determined that no other divers had been down into the cave that Sunday. It's not uncommon to have multiple groups coordinate timing to get a few groups into the cave each day. The pair took significant extra time trying to find the guideline, and had another group gone down, they could have led them to safety before Rich and Kevin ran out of air. Tony gave his first-person account of this tragedy. For him, it was personal. He dove with Rich just a few weeks before the disaster and knew he was a good-hearted man and a cautious diver. Tony and many other cave divers and rescuers came to Rich's funeral to pay their last respects. The overwhelming disasters of caves can conquer even the most trained pros. Let this story serve as a reminder that even when cavers make horrible choices, they are still people loved by someone, and they will be missed. Did this heart-wrenching ending make you think about how lucky some cavers have been over the years? Would you take the plunge to explore Madison Blue Springs? Let us know in the comments section. Subscribe for more grim tales and rescue celebrations from beyond the depth.